Hello, welcome to episode 145 of the Juicebox Podcast. Today's episode is sponsored by Dexcom and Omnipod. We'll be talking a little more about both later in the show, and there are also links in your show notes. But at any time, day or night, that you get the feeling like you want to just know more, you can go to dexcom.com/juicebox or myomnipod.com/juicebox. In the beginning of 2018, a study came out that said that they found that insulin can degrade during the shipping process. And it went out in the public and everybody got very upset about it. I got a lot of notes from you guys. A lot of notes saying, hey, can you please find the person who wrote this study and find out more? And so you know what I did? I found him. This episode is with Alan Carter. Alan is the lead on the study. The study is called Insulin Concentration in Vials Randomly Purchased in Pharmacies in the United States. Considerable loss in the cold supply chain. Okay, listen, a couple of things. First of all, nothing you hear on the Juicebox podcast should be considered advice, medical or otherwise. But second, don't let that kind of boring title to Alan's paper throw you off here. This is a really good conversation. Alan has done a lot of work for people with type 1 diabetes over the years. He works for a nonprofit, and he's insanely good at describing this process without it being, let's just say, as boring as the title of Alan's paper, which is very good. He even at the end will offer an email address. If you want to read the entire paper, all you have to do is email him. He'll send it to you. I mean, come on, what a good guy. All right, you guys ready? This is Alan Carter. I don't know what to call this episode because I don't think I can call it Insulin Concentration in Vials Randomly Purchased in Pharmacies in the United States, Considerable Loss in the Cold Supply Chain. I'm going to have to think of something else.
Well, I'm Alan Carter, and I'm a PharmD pharmacist with 40 years experience of working with patients with all kinds of diseases, including diabetes, and I've done some work in monitoring, helping people monitor their diabetes outcomes using alternate tests such as fructosamine besides just blood glucose. So I took an interest in why biosimilar insulins might be problematic in the supply, and I know if patients have had issues with their control that they couldn't determine anything else other than maybe the insulin wasn't quite as potent as they were expecting it to be, and thought this would be a good idea to try and compare two different insulins to see how much difference we could find.
It's interesting. So, Alan, you and I'm assuming there's other authors on your paper. Are you the lead, or how does that work?
I was the lead. I was the guy who had the bright idea to try and do this, and then convinced MRI Global to provide a grant to look into it further, just to see what kind of differences might be there, since we do analytical work for a lot of government and private clients in drug development and stability testing and various other activities involving toxicology and pharmacology, and I've been doing so for over 40 years here in Kansas City.
Wow. Okay. Well, so this paper, the title of this paper is Insulin Concentration in Vials Randomly Purchased in Pharmacies in the United States, Considerable Loss in the Cold Supply Chain. And when your paper published and it made its way around the diabetes community online, I think it really was alarming to people. The idea that, so can you explain just how you started? It's such a simple concept, but you guys went to a pharmacy and what'd you do?
Well, we have a pharmacy here at Kansas City that I'm the manager of, and we support clinical trials throughout the world for National Cancer Institute. And through that, I could acquire insulin directly from our wholesaler. And having been a pharmacist in community pharmacy for many years, I also know that there's different wholesalers around that you could get. And I thought, well, this would be a good opportunity to collect a variety of lots to see if we could get detect any changes between lot to lot and different manufacturers to compare to see if the insulin concentrations would be what would be expected and any other breakdown products that might be there from shipping and handling, just as a what-if type idea. And in order to get a variety of lots in a fairly short period of time, and from different wholesalers, I know of other pharmacies here in Kansas City from my years of working with different people, and arranged to pick up and have purchased some insulin from them. And NPH and Regular are over-the-counter type insulins, you don't have to have a prescription for them. So I could go buy them as a consumer, and I knew which stores bought from different wholesalers. So I managed to collect over a period of time the different lots and stored them in our refrigerator in the pharmacy till we got ready to move them to the laboratory for analytical work. And our refrigeration systems here are based under what they call good manufacturing practices standards, and we have, which is better than most pharmacies have, where we're monitoring our refrigeration and freezer temperatures 24/7 so that we can tell whether it gets too hot or too cold. So that's a little better than the average pharmacy has. Most pharmacies just check it twice a day with a thermometer and a refrigerator, which should be good enough. But we were trying to ensure that we didn't expose it to any unusual handling once we had it in our hands.
Right. And when we stop and think about this idea that this insulin's manufactured somewhere, that manufacturer keeps it cold, they ship it somewhere, that person has to keep it cold, it has to stay cold during the transportation process, it probably gets shipped again and again before it hits a pharmacy, or maybe you have a mail order pharmacy that you get your insulin from, or maybe, whatever. There's so many leaps from the moment it's manufactured to the moment you get it home in your refrigerator, which, none of our refrigerators are probably even as close to being, perfect as you would hope, as the pharmacy might be. But there's just a bunch of opportunities for it to get warmer or to be stored at a temperature that's not optimal. Can you tell me when that happens, what happens to the insulin when it's not kept at the right temperature?
Well, as it gets warmer, it breaks down on a fairly linear rate, which Lilly in 2003 provided a comment showing that it degrades at about 1% a day if it's at room temperature 77. 1% a month if it's at room temperature 77 degrees. But it's linear. The higher the temperature, the faster the degradation rate is. But it'll still have some activity. If you keep it in a refrigerator, it loses 0.1% of activity per month. So refrigeration would be preferred. But the problem of insulin, too, is you keep it in a refrigerator and it gets frozen, then that's just as bad as being too hot. Might even be worse in some cases. Like in the NPH, if it freezes, it actually falls out of its suspension and becomes totally unpredictable in what its activity would be. And it won't look quite right when you try and mix it after it's been frozen. And I've had patients have their insulin get frozen because they couldn't afford to buy more, continue to use the insulin, sometimes for several months, and have their control just go completely out of whack because their insulin is only given a small portion of its activity because it's been frozen first. So that may be more of a problem than much heat.
So there's this concentration of activity that the insulin has, and as it breaks down, it loses its effectiveness. And and it's funny because I was just thinking about it getting warmer, but now you're talking about if it gets too cold, if it freezes, you have a similar, if not a worse issue. And so what did you, because you and I spoke previously to this because we didn't know each other, and I reached out and I told you that I really would like to shed more light on what you did. And at the same time, my overarching concern is I believe that when people are managing their type 1 diabetes, sometimes the biggest mistake they make is they sit around looking for reasons. Like something doesn't go exactly right, and they'll stare at a blood sugar of 250 for 3 hours trying to figure out, like, did I miscount the carbs? What did I do wrong? And, part of what they think is maybe it's the insulin. And by the time you go through this incredible checklist of things and the waiting, it's always sort of my idea, like just more insulin. Like if you're higher, just use more. Maybe the reason's important and we can figure it out down the road. But in the moment, I get scared that in the moment, people will get frozen with the fear of there's so many variables that they can't figure out what happened and they end up not doing anything. And so as much as I want to shed light on this, I don't want to scare people into thinking that this is one more thing for them to, in their day-to-day, moment-to-moment, to be overwhelmed with. And so I really do want to understand clearly what you guys learned. So can you help me a little bit understand what the paper's telling us? Because I am not nearly smart enough to read it and make sense of it.
Well, and it is one of those things where you give yourself a dose of insulin and you expect a certain response. You start a new vial. You should monitor your sugars carefully for the first dose or two to make sure that your body's responding to this particular lot the same way it did on a previous lot. And as insulin is in your care and in your pump and getting to body temperature, it may be slightly less effective over time if it's been 2 or 3 days in the reservoir before you change it out. So there may be a little bit there, but as long as it's losing potency, if you're using a pump system and continuous monitoring, you'll be able to increase your dose of insulin enough to offset the high blood sugar or alter your diet. It's just when you use that first dose out of a new vial, it may be more potent than the one you just had for a variety of reasons of being handled. So, again, most diabetes patients know that just by experience. And so to not panic, but at the other side of the coin is if you're doing everything the way you've been prescribed and you're following the same routine and you get a number that doesn't make sense and you don't know that you're sick, it's possible the insulin is not as potent as what you expected it to be.
Right. And that's something that we all assume and guess at and everything, but what you guys did sort of proved it out, which is so what did you learn that when you bought these different lots from the different distributors, what came to light?
I learned that it looks like the insulin is handled very similar from pharmacy to the next. That the supply chain may affect the concentration of insulin that's active in the vial throughout the region. I mean, this is just a snapshot of the Midwest. You may have a completely different outcome in the East or West Coast, or North or South. It could vary from season as well. So, but the average insulin, if it's a little lower in its potency on average, your systems can adapt for that, and you can increase the insulin dose, and you'll do just fine. It's just when you get a new vial that's significantly more potent than the previous one you've been using, and that can be because you've used a vial too long, you've kept it around for too many months after you opened it, you're going to potentially have a low blood sugar reading if you give yourself the same dose as you gave on a previous vial. And there is no recognized method for an analytical lab to pull it out of the vial and check and see once in a while, just to spot check to see how the supply chain has affected the concentration based on what it was when it left the manufacturer. There is no recognized method for that. And I think that needs to be standardized and agreed upon amongst everybody. Because
you know the retail side of it and what happens. And so all these steps, plus it hits retail. And what ends up happening is you put this insulin in so many different people's hands. And when you leave it to their best intention, it's their idea of what the best thing to do is. And you're saying that there need to be rules in place that they have to follow. And this will keep not only the standard level, but hopefully the quality of the insulin higher and more stable.
Well, and I would postulate that it's a good idea for the system to have a way of just spot checking product at the pharmacy level at the end of the supply chain just before it reaches the patient, just to make sure any drug is meeting its standard, the minimum amount the FDA says it's supposed to have in the label, and its quality is assured. Because what we're running into is a global supply chain, and the global supply chain introduces even far more risky transportation factors potentially than what we currently face. And now that we're thinking of Amazon getting into distribution of drugs, and insulin could be one of those medications that they distribute cheaply, and people need to afford their medication, absolutely have to afford it, so they reach for the lowest cost possible. You have to make sure that the delivery of the drug product to the patient is meeting the quality it should meet based on the original FDA-approved release standards.
Yeah, and if you test along increments, so you're saying just you randomly pull a vial from a shipment and it gets tested on site, and if it reaches you at your step and it's not good, then maybe the last step was the issue or whatever, but at least it doesn't reach people. It's such an odd idea, right, that this well-intended medication leaves the manufacturer, and that along the way, the idea is sort of hands thrown up in the air, like, well, if it gets to you good, it gets to you good, and if it doesn't, what are we going to do about it?
And That's the concern I've had, because I've seen other medications that have what they call a narrow therapeutic range, and with Coumadin being an example, brand name worked great, and we had people switch to the generic, and they had issues with bleeding, and nobody could figure out why. When they finally analyzed the generic version, and it was 101% of what it labeled said, and you're allowed plus or minus 5% of that 100% labeling. So if it's supposed to have 100 milligrams in it, you can have 105 or as little as 95 milligrams and still be considered to be accurately representing what's on the label. Well, it had 101, and consistently, lot to lot, they did a great job of manufacturing it. The brand name had 97, 98% level, and that little difference was enough to make people have a bleeding issue. It can be that close and that narrow, and nobody's doing anything wrong. But if you throw in something that's affected by the supply chain, such as insulin biologic products, then we probably need to keep a little closer eye on what the supply chain impact is to that particular medication, because it can be detrimental.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
No, it absolutely does, and there are different people are with insulin trying to make different accomplishments. Like my daughter's blood sugar, she doesn't feel well right now. She's got a head cold, and her blood sugar I can see is 130, and in my heart that's high, and I'm trying to do something about it. But when you get down to these kind of low tolerances where you're just talking about a couple of points one way or the other, it is very important for the insulin to react the way you're expecting it to,
exactly.
Especially if you're not trying to, you don't want to cause a low. And at the same time, people who are less comfortable being, aggressive with the insulin, they're also in a space where the efficacy of the medication could be the difference between 50 and 100 points in these higher ranges. And then, it's even more frightening to make these large boluses at a higher range when you can't expect, you're already more insulin resistant when your blood sugar is higher to begin with. And now if you can't at least hope that the insulin's going to do somewhat near what you expect it to do. And
right.
I mean, I'll tell you this, that, my daughter doesn't use, she uses an Omnipod. So every 3 days her reservoir gets changed out, and we fill the pod up to its capacity, which is 200 units. So when I open a new vial of insulin, my house is kept pretty standardly right between 68 and 70 degrees. It doesn't get much hotter. It doesn't get much colder. Once we open a new vial of insulin, we don't actually ever put it back in the refrigerator. But it's probably gone in, a couple of weeks. And I don't know that we've ever had an issue. I've never think about the insulin as being like an issue. But what do you think of that? Do you think I should be putting it back in the refrigerator? Omnipod is, in my opinion, the very best insulin pump on the market. Arden has been using it for almost a decade now, it feels like. I don't know, she was 4 years old, she's 13 now, that's almost a decade, right? And we could not be happier. My daughter's A1C has been between 5.6 and 6.2 for 4 years. A huge part of that is the technology that we talk about here on the show, the Dexcom and the Omnipod. But all of the great adjustments that I make with Omnipod, all of the ability I have to give her insulin in situations when other people's pumps have to be disconnected, none of that exists with Omnipod. We can keep Arden's insulin delivery where we want it, and that is how we stay in control of her blood sugar, keeping it manageable. You know what I mean? Not out of control, no spikes and craziness. I mean, it happens sometimes. It happens to everybody, but I'm talking about for the most part. The freedom that the Omnipod gives us it's unmatched. I don't see anybody else that can do it. I want you to go to myomnipod.com/juicebox. You're going to fill out a tiny bit of information. When you do, Omnipod is going to send you out a free, no obligation demo pod. You can try it on and see for yourself. Now, there's nothing better than that. It's free. There's absolutely no obligation. Like I said, nothing, no reason not to. There's no strings attached here. No strings attached, no tubes attached. I mean, you see what I'm saying right now. Give it a try. There's nothing to lose. It doesn't cost you anything. And I think you might agree with me once you get it and you see it. myomnipod.com/juicebox. Manage your blood sugar the way Arden does. Do you think I should be putting it back in the refrigerator?
No, Well, and you're also using an insulin analog, and we did not look at the insulin analogs, and that should be the next step we look at too. The regular and NPH were originally developed in the 80s. The analogs have been new, and we don't have great information on what its stability is once opened, other than the manufacturer says it should be thrown away within 28 days. So there's some question there. Maybe they are more stable. And then when you put it in a reservoir, your body temperature is 98.6 if you don't have a fever, and that could affect how stable the insulin is over 3 days, but doesn't appear to be an issue based on everybody's experience. So that part of it, if you're doing it that way, you're fine. The only thing I would, anytime you open up a new vial that's from a different lot than you've had before, there is a slight chance it'll have either more or less potency. But if it's a little under or a little over, it should be fine. You're not going to have a crash. But if you're running really, really tight control, as some people want to do, then that change may be enough to trigger a lower low than what you anticipate, or a higher high than what you anticipate based on your dose, because there may be some variance between those vials.
Yeah, so it's definitely... I'm sorry, I cut you off. Go ahead.
Well, I and thinking outside the box, if you had some way of testing that vial at home to make sure that it is, got intact. So if had some way of doing a test strip on it, that might be helpful in making sure that you're assured that your insulin has not been frozen or been too hot at some point in time.
Well, that's interesting. So you know how when you got the regular NPH in a lab, what testing you did. Do you think a test strip is a feasible idea?
It's a interesting thought and idea, and we have some really cool technologies now, and I have a few friends and colleagues that have thought that might not be a bad approach to think about. So I believe there is some interest in at least the academic world to see if they could. It's a challenge. See if you could find some way of creating a home testing kit that would let you check once in a while for your insulin concentration, just to make sure. Because if you get it in the mail, it could have been exposed to extremely high heat, or it could have been frozen, and you wouldn't know that if it had reached room temperature or refrigeration temperature when you got it. Somewhere along the line, it might have been damaged, and you wouldn't know it, and nobody would know, because the vials are enclosed in cardboard boxes, and you don't see them until you open the box.
Right. You know what I was just thinking, and what you just said made me think, is the answer possibly that there's something in with the shipment that is an indicator if you've left a range? I don't know what that would be, if it's a monitorable,
There are temp track devices that we use when we ship products to various trials and things, and are used when you have a temperature critical product. And you can put it in the center of the box, and it will, or near the center, and it'll give you the average temperature that box has been exposed, has inside of it over a period of time until you pull it out and stop the tracking. And you can download that onto a computer and see the graph on an Adobe reader. So it's very easy to do. They're not terribly cheap, and they tend to do it on large shipments, but it measures just like the monitors that we use in our refrigerations or anybody's refrigerator. It's the sensor is in one spot, and it's giving you the average temperature for the whole refrigerator. Doesn't mean that one corner doesn't get below the temperature or above the temperature you want to set it for. Have you ever put anything in your refrigerator and thinking, it's fine, go back a few days later and pull out and it's frozen?
Right, but not everything in the refrigerator is frozen.
But not everything's frozen in a refrigerator. So that happens, and it could happen in a shipment too. If you've got a shipment of insulin and it's sitting too close to the cold pack, and that cold pack happens to be too cold, or the outside temperature is colder than anticipated during shipment, it's possible that vial or that pin that's closest to the cold pack might partially freeze. Now, the agitation of shipping and stuff like that should keep it somewhat mixed, but it may not. So it's possible that a portion of it might get too cold or too hot, and the rest of the shipment temperature tract would show that it stayed within the expected ranges that you need to keep it. So those things could happen, and it'd be just a simple luck of the draw. And it could be that our results on what we found happened to just be vials that got excursions beyond the temperatures they should have been. And if you went back and tested the same did the same kind of test later on a different shipment, they may be just fine.
You know, what I'm realizing here is the penguins have already answered our question. You just have to find a way to mechanically duplicate it. Have you ever seen penguins keep warm and they create that kind of that circle where we're the one in the middle and they walk in a circle.
Rotating in and out.
Yeah, they keep rotating. That's all you got to do. Alan, just go figure that out.
Piece of cake. We don't want to put any kind of panic into anybody. It's just an awareness. People need to be aware of what might be going on. And I've had patients complain that the insulin that they got from the pharmacy just didn't give them the results that they got from the previous dispensing. And they get a new vial or a new box of pens, and their control shows back up. I've had 2 patients in the last 15 years that could actually show me their diaries. They included their food intake and their exercise and said, I haven't changed anything except I got the new insulin, and my control started to slide out of control. And I was having to use more insulin, or it wasn't uniform in how I was seeing, and I didn't change anything else. We think it was the insulin. I'm saying, well, you must have been sick, or you must have the medication. You try any herbal supplements. Did you have any alcohol to drink? Did you? And no, I didn't change anything except my insulin. But we, as clinicians, tend to think, well, there's too many variables here, and it could never be the insulin. Well, that may be the insulin, and we don't just need to discard that information when it's reported. That the patient may be telling the truth, that they didn't do anything different, and maybe it is the insulin. So we'd like to have some way of uniformly determining whether it was the insulin or not, because I hate just guessing. I don't like to guess. I'd like to know. It's
worth knowing, and it's worth trying to understand. That's for certain. Do you think that from the pharmaceutical end, do you think that is just the cost of doing business? That once in a while you're going to get a vial that's not as good as the other ones, and do you think that there's just nothing they can do about it? How would you like to be able to see your child's blood sugar 24 hours a day, whenever you want to? Sounds good? When they're at school, at a friend's house, at a sleepover, in the backyard, playing baseball, playing football. How does that sound? Do you have an iPhone or an Android phone? Because it works with both. You like that? I know you do. How about this? Forget the share for a second. How would you like to know that your child's blood sugar is starting to creep up or beginning to fall? Or, oh my gosh, falling really quickly or rising really fast? You thought you did the right pre-bolus at lunch, but all of a sudden, bang, your blood sugar's flying up. You wouldn't know that without a Dexcom. If you're just testing, there'd be no way to see that. Dexcom's going to tell you right away, hey, you've told me to let you know when you've gone above this blood sugar, and you are. And by the way, it's happening quickly. So here's an alert that tells you not only are you going up, but you're going up fast. This gives you an opportunity to jump right back into the game and make an adjustment. You take a spike that was going to go to 300 and you stop it. It's amazing. This is information you have to have. This is the kind of information I use constantly all day when you hear me talking about the things that I talk about. Pre-bolusing Arden for lunch, eating carb-heavy meals, all that stuff is made possible with Omnipod and Dexcom. To find out more, please go to dexcom.com/juicebox or hit the link in your show notes and get started today. If you're not using a CGM, I can't stress enough that I think you should be. All right, listen. Let's finish up here with Alan, and then let's get you back to your life, all right? But don't forget Dexcom and Omnipod this week. Use the links, find out more.
I think the manufacturers are concerned because, one, they want to ensure that you get product that's good. I mean, that's how they make their living. They can't be bad at it because it threatens their entire business model. You have to depend on them to be correct, and they expect to be correct all the time. But they also have to realize, and they do realize, that they can't control the shipping systems very well. That's sort of beyond their capability, and understandably so. So, and again, the cost of making insulin is not cheap, and the cost of shipping insulin is not necessarily cheap. And if we try to make it more complicated, it becomes more expensive, which is not great for anybody. So how do we crack this nut without causing a lot of problems? But I think the information should be at least somehow available to the public, that they need to think about that, be careful how they keep their insulin, and also the shippers and the manufacturers need to be careful how their insulin is shipped and handled. But we need some uniform. The biggest challenge we have is trying to find a recognized method to test it. And there isn't any. And the manufacturers haven't shared that information because that's considered proprietary information. They don't want to give that away. But how do we verify this? How do we double check and make sure that's true? That's what I'd like to see come out of this, is that we all agree on, well, this method for a spot check is going to be repeatable every time, and we can get results that we can depend on being, this is what actually measurement is at this point. Then we can do a spot check once in a while to make sure and fine-tune the delivery systems so that maybe we keep the insulin under better control. And possibly it is rotating your package so many times during shipment. How we do that, I'm not sure. Or maybe by insulating the container a little differently with the cold packs, so maybe we don't get a cold spot in it. Maybe that's something we need to look at. But we need to be able to track the temperature from the moment the manufacturer puts it in a vial until the pharmacy dispenses it to the patient. And then the patient then can, hopefully, ideally, would be able to continue to monitor that vial's temperature changes while they have it, because things happen when in life happens. You go on a trip and you use a refrigerator in a hotel and it freezes your insulin. Oh my gosh, what do I do? Somebody's going to have to buy some more insulin somewhere because you don't know what his activity is. Or you go take a trip and you forget and leave your thing in the car and it's 100 degrees outside, or for some reason the car's temperature gets to 180 inside, which is not unusual in certain parts of the country. Did I destroy the insulin I have on reserve in the car? Those things happen all the time, every day. How do we help you determine whether you've got to run out and find another bottle of insulin and are going to have to buy a $500 box of insulin syringes or pens to replace the one that just got inadvertently damaged because accident happened?
I always think that, and I've had this thought out loud a couple of times, and I've actually spoken to somebody at a pharma company once and said this. I don't know why they don't just, and maybe there's a million business reasons why this idea is terrible, I have no idea, but people get mail order insulin nowadays. Why doesn't the manufacturer just get in the business of being the middleman and moving the insulin directly from manufacturer to the home? Or
manufacturer directly to the pharmacy so the patient can pick it up. And
right,
that's
right.
The hard part is.
Right.
And I guess in Europe that's the way it's done. But one of the interesting comments that's come out of this whole thing was diabetes management experts are thinking, this just can't be right. And I understand why they would think that way. But I've had response from people that have used insulin, and in Europe they use a method where it's a pooled purchase across Europe, and it's called parallel purchasing. And yes, they get it from the pharmacy, but that supply may have routed through the Eastern Bloc countries where it was originally sent to at a much lower price and labeled in that language. Then they'll relabel it in English or Spanish or Italian and ship it into those countries for their citizens' use. And it's picked up at the pharmacy. So the insulin has been shipped to one country as a low price because that country hasn't got an economy that can afford an expensive insulin. And they turn around and then repackage it and ship it into other countries in Europe as a parallel purchase so that country also enjoys the lower price. And there has been one report to me that by an individual saying, I couldn't get control of my insulin, of my diabetes when this started happening. I asked the manufacturer to check the stuff. And I said, well, it looks like it's within spec, but I was still without control. The government program allowed me to directly get it from the manufacturer to my pharmacy or to me, and my control returned, but it already had some damage done, neuropathies that started to show up because it took a couple of years to figure out what was going on. And so that person suspects that particular delivery supply chain is bad for the quality of insulin that they've got, and they had some adverse outcomes because of that. So, and that's just one anecdotal report, but that's some of the feedback we're getting from patients is that the supply chain just seemed to impact the quality of the insulin, and it needs to be improved.
Taking care of your diabetes is already It's already hard enough. But the thing to go through that entire process and the insulin you're using isn't effective is just, boy, it makes it feel like the whole thing's just a waste of time and a disaster, and
you don't want to do that,
right?
But at the same time, I grew up in Missouri and I work in Missouri. And Missouri is what's called a show me state. You can tell me everything's good, but you got to show me once in a while. It doesn't have to be every time, but at least I want definitive proof that I'm getting what I'm getting and what's being discussed is true. So that's kind of what I feel here is we just need to check once in a while and have some mechanism which everybody agrees on is a good way of doing it, and look at the insulin quality periodically. Doesn't have to be every lot or every day, but just once in a while check, and then come up with a better way of delivering it so that we can help ensure that it's staying consistent when it reaches the individual trying to use it. Now, once the individual gets it, it would be nice if you could monitor it too from home, and there are ways to do that as well, but because that adds another wrinkle. But not everybody can afford to do that. Diabetes is expensive disease to manage, and it's a lifetime lifestyle, and a lot of people can't afford it to do it properly. That's why we're seeing some people revert back to the NPH and regulars, because you can buy NPH and regular at Walmart or Sam's Club for $25 a vial. That's pretty cheap, and we used to manage people successfully using NPH and regular before the analogs came out. It's not the best method today, but if that's all you can afford, that's what you got to go with.
Yeah, right. Well, so what you've done so far with tracking the NPH and the regular, do you have any plans to do it with the analogs, with the Novalogs and Apetras, stuff like that?
We'd love to get a group of people together to determine the best method to do this and a usable, workable protocol to follow that mimics real-world situations, which is what we try to do with the way we collected the vials. We tried to mimic what you would do if you were a patient and bought it in a pharmacy or got it dispensed to you and you got a 90-day supply and you've kept it in your refrigerator at home. And a variety of different lots that you might get over a period of time. We tried to duplicate that. But to take that type of concept that we're using a real-world snapshot periodically to look at it and using an agreed-upon analytical method to determine how much insulin is in the pen or the vial, and how much is the intact insulin, how much is the breakdown products. Probably would be necessary to do a test to see what the impact is in a person through controlled trial of what they call insulin clamp studies, using that same lot to see how well what effect it might be on raising or lowering your blood sugar. To do a comprehensive look, at least on occasion, just as an insurance policy. I like to think of it as we've got speed limits on highways. Does everybody follow the speed limit? No. Because there's nobody watching, nobody looking to see. If the sheriff's 2 miles down the road and running a radar trap, going to slow down. Well, maybe that's what we need, is just once in a while a check. Doesn't have to be everything, just so that the supply chain is being at least monitored a little bit. Right now, there is no monitoring of the supply chain that I'm aware of.
Right, and in the supply chain, if you're one of these steps along the way, and like you said, no one's watching, there's no real onus on you if you want to cheap out, if you want to be less safe with it, because once it gets it's kicked the can. Once it's that far down the road, it's off your shoulders. Nobody can prove it was you. So, and
that's why the manufacturers are concerned too, is because if it's not quality and they have to take it back, then that's a loss. It's kind of like a counterfeit $20 bill.
Mm-hmm.
If you're caught with a counterfeit $20 bill, you eat the loss. It's your problem. There's nobody to pass it back to, and the manufacturers, I think, are concerned that they would be forced to take stuff back that they have no control over, and it's not their fault that it got exposed to bad temperature. So it's sort of what I don't know is good for me. If I know too much, then it might be bad for me, and that's not just the manufacturers. Whoever happens to have possession of the insulin.
Yeah, it's interesting when you really stop and break it down like this and think about it. It's easy to be upset. Like when you hear something like this, I think people's minds go right to the pharma company, right? Like that's their fault. But fault is spread out all over the place, and maybe not even it might not even be fault. There could be a link in your supply chain that feels like they're doing everything right and they're not, and they don't even know. And that's
correct.
Right.
That's correct. We definitely do not blame pharma for this. I mean, it's possible, really remotely possible, that somebody's running really poor quality control, but that's just impossible to believe or even think. But the reality is that the supply chain is really the weakest link in the chain is the supply chain itself. And how do we look at that and address it and correct anything to reduce the risk? You're not going to eliminate the risk, just to reduce the risk that the insulin arrives in your hands as a patient in the concentration that you expect it to be, so that you can use it and rely on its activity, and understanding that there's going to be absorption differences day to day based on your site of injection. There's going to be differences in your activity and your caloric burn day to day, hour to hour. There are variances in diabetes that you just cannot address. But if we know the insulin is within a certain range of potency when you get it, and you know how to take care of it when you're at home, and you're monitoring that too, then you've eliminated
just one less factor to
another
worry
unknown.
About. Yeah. I mean, if we're being fair, sitting here talking, like the pharmaceutical companies have the power. They're the ones paying the shippers. They could put constraints on them and say, look, you have to do this, this, and this, or you don't work for us anymore. And I'm assuming that's a fairly large account that these people would not want to lose. And so you would think you could strong arm the shippers to do the right thing.
The concern is once you do that, you raise the cost.
Yes.
And we're already complaining about the cost now.
Right.
So that's the other side of the coin, is just to do it right, it's going to cost more money. It
costs more money. Mm-hmm. Yes, so we're stuck in a perpetual circle of what's good enough and at what price. Right,
and we like to just determine what's good enough. And right now, it doesn't look like, based on our data, it may not be good enough. Can we improve that without making it ridiculously expensive? That's the goal, and could be now with technology. We could get they could put a temperature track device that would work either on every box or in every shrink wrap group of insulin, because they usually come 10 in a package, 10 vials in a shrink wrap package. If you buy enough of them, that's how it'll show up to you to help in shipping and packing. And have a monitor at least in that level, on how big a level do you keep that monitor, and monitor it from A to Z, point A to point Z. And ideally, if you could move that monitoring capability to the patient's hand, then that would help them keep track of their insulin temperatures during everyday life.
Right. So what did you do when you finished the paper? Did you pass it on to industry, or what was you assume they just know that it exists?
When we ran this, we were trying to see what other differences we could find in insulin. We weren't looking for a concentration insulin specifically. We wanted to see how much different the two biosimilar products, because they're not technically biosimilars, but in reality, that's what they are. The NPH and regular have been made for years by two different companies, and they're made different ways, but they're supposed to be human insulin at 100 units per milliliter concentration. So we thought, okay, it's human insulin. There may be slight differences in what else we might find in the vials. Let's look. But the very first step is to identify the insulin, because we have a USP standard to do that with, and we can make up a USP value of 100 units per mil solution, treat it the same way we do the insulin when we draw it from the vials for injecting in a machine, LCMS device to measure it. So we should have a known standard and then measure everything else against it. And when we got the data, it's like, what happened here? Doesn't match what we expected, except one vial came really close to what we thought our target should be, 94.2. That's within a sneeze of being exactly what it says it's supposed to be on the vial. So we were trying to figure out what we might have done wrong. And as we tried to dig into that data, we found that there is no documented way to look at insulin in a vial to check its true concentration that we can find. The manufacturers have it, but they don't want to share that information. And then we tried to figure out who would be interested in looking at this information to see what it might be. And really, it was kind of like a hot potato. Nobody wanted to touch it. And I understand. I mean, it's so controversial You don't want to blow things up without some kind of way of determining it. But since there's no documented way that we know of to cross-check all this stuff, it's just original data, and we'd like to see it move forward with additional testing using methods that people agree on is the best way of doing it, and checking the analogs probably next. But we need to make sure we're all on the same page before we start down that path. And finding somebody to fund that has been a challenge, and as it is a hot potato, nobody really wants to own this.
Yeah, who wants to prove that might not that might be true? Also, that it doesn't benefit anybody who you can get money from to do the study. That's for certain.
No.
Geez. Well, Alan, I appreciate you coming on and explaining this to me, because I saw your paper. It came across my feed a couple of times, and I looked at it and I thought, oh, that is really interesting. But then I actually started getting notes one day from a bunch of people who were like, can you find out more about this? And I said, well, I can try. So I appreciate you responding so quickly and getting on so quick. We're actually going to put this up next week so that people can listen to it and try to understand better. Is there a place I can point them to get the full paper that they can read, or is it available online as a full text?
It's available as an abstract online at the Journal of Diabetes Science and Technology, and that requires a subscription. For individuals who want to see it, I can release it on a person-to-person basis, which is kind of how it got started out in the general public. And I just can't release it in general because that violates the journal's agreement. So I would be willing to release it to individuals if they want to read the entire paper, with the idea that it's for their use, their personal use, not for general release to everybody. And you could reach me at my email address is on that contact information.
Sure, I'll put it in the show notes. So anybody who really wants to dig into the text, there'll be a link in the show notes. You can contact Alan, and he'll send it out for you. And as long as you don't share it in public, it'll be good.
I see this as an issue that's going to take all of us to solve. It's not something that one person can solve. We just need to find the best way.
So at the end consumer, if they want to voice their concern, who do you think they point it at?
Well, my guess would be the FDA would be the first official group to point their concerns to, and ask them if there is a way of doing a better check of the supply chain to ensure that the product received at the pharmacies are good, and then periodically at the dispensing point of the patient too, making sure that what the pharmacies, because we've got no way in the pharmacy level to figure out whether it's good. We just have to assume it is, just like everybody else.
Whole conversation.
I was a whole other description.
Yeah, this whole conversation just makes me think over and over again about the insulin that we're sending to third world countries to help. Like, what shape is that showing up in?
Well, and the other concern is when you get to reimportation of drugs, and that's a big issue, a Canadian drug supply, and you can do that, but the FDA says that's not safe. This is why it's not safe, is it can go to a third world country, and this has happened before, and it gets rerouted back into the general supply and then sent back into the United States or into Europe or into Australia. That was never intended to reach here, and who knows where it went and how long it sat there. And that's what you get into with a global supply chain. You need some way to monitor the quality of the product when it reaches the end consumer.
Okay. All right. So, well, I wish you luck getting funding to do it, to continue the work. I think it's really important, and I wanted to thank you very much for shining a light on it. It's obviously something all of us always have thought, but it was very interesting to see somebody to prove it out in the real world. So thank you very much.
I thank you for inviting me to be on your program, and if there's anything I can do to help you or anyone in the diabetes community, please feel free to reach out.
Thanks so much, Alan. Thank you, Dexcom. Thank you, Omnipod. Thank you to you, the listener. I appreciate every one of you. I really do. Congratulations to Amy and Jennifer for winning my last giveaway. It was a big grab bag full of Bold with Insulin stuff, t-shirts and stickers and magnets and everything. Congratulations, guys. Your gifts are coming soon. Also, stay tuned. There's a lot of new news coming from Omnipod, and we're going to have some people on from Omnipod to talk about it in the coming weeks. We We have a ton of great interviews coming up, and there's always, timely stuff like today with Alan, which will slip in. You guys, if you're not subscribed, please subscribe in your podcast catcher app, whichever app you're using. Hit subscribe. That way you don't have to count on me putting it on social media, and it is actually one of my dreams where you guys all subscribe and I no longer have to put anything on social media, which would be a wonderful respite for me. So if you want to do something nice for me, just subscribe. You make less work for me on the other side. Again, the show continues to grow. It's doing fantastic, and it does that because you guys are sharing. So thank you very much, and please continue to let other people know about the Juicebox Podcast. I'll see you guys next week.